Hey everyone, welcome to the SIG Network Policy API sub-project meeting. Today is the 19th of November 2024. Let's all follow the Kubernetes Code of Conduct and be kind to one another. We don't have much on the agenda. We're all just back from KubeCon and we had some really nice face-to-face meetings. I know that there is a dry run mode in PEP that Nadia has opened, which is linked on the agenda, 276, which is after a follow-up discussion in KubeCon. I know many people have already been asking for this, and I think she's trying to gather all those use cases so that we can keep track of it. So if folks are interested in reviewing this, please do. I think she started with the bare minimum use cases that we've all spoken about. I also started another NPEP for the service account selector discussion, which also came up during this KubeCon and the previous KubeCon. So I thought it's high time at least we write it down, no matter what we decide on having service accounts as subjects and PS. So there is an NPEP 274 also, which is a follow-up. So both Nadia's NPEP for dry run and service accounts as selectors that I have 274, both are trying to gather use cases. So if anybody has use cases or wants to review, reviews are welcome. They are from KubeCon discussions. And then based on what we spoke at KubeCon, I also opened an issue 275 to remove the concept of extended fields, which means we also don't need the core concept anymore. So we can only have, we can have standard and experimental, but not have core and extended, since we decided extended is not going to happen. And if we need it in the future, we can always come back to it. There might be some API fields which might require the extended option, but for now, I think we all agree that it doesn't make sense with the fields we have currently. And I think Dan has just commented now that we should consider whether the channel terminology makes sense or not. Seems to not go well with gateway. Yeah. Yeah, we only have experimental features, it's more like stable and unstable. I don't really mind renaming the term channel to something more appropriate.
So I don't know, am I choppy? I've been having some network problems.
You sound fine to me, actually.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know exactly what channels is supposed to mean, but like I think there was this whole idea of like you switch between the standard and experimental channels, and they kept talking about how that's like totally failing for them, and like it causes your gateways to suddenly lose features unexpectedly, and or like
Yeah.
when a feature moves from experimental to standard, then you want to stop using the experimental, but there's no like clear way to do that. So it seems like we copied this from them, but it's not working for them. So we should probably
Rethink it. Yeah, the
yeah.
only thing that channel really meant to me when we were initially starting off is there's two different CRDs that we are shipping, or I don't know, we don't ship it, but when we release a patch version, there's two different channels they can consume from, but maybe channel is not the right word. What I meant was they can install either the standard CRD or the experimental CRD. Maybe we don't need a suffix called channel to distinguish those two ways, right? Like,
Okay, I didn't realize that we were actually publishing two separate CRDs. I mean, that does kind of sound like channels then. The
yeah.
question is whether that
Like, for
really
example,
ends
if
up.
you were to cut the 0.6 release, right? Effectively, I think in that release, we are shipping two different CRDs for people to install on their clusters.
Is it kind of are we in a bit of a different situation than the gateway folks because the implementation is shipping the CRD and it tends to be that there's only one. I don't think we have like multiple providers that are going to conflict, whereas perhaps for gateway you might have a few things that all need to agree on the CRD version. Like for us, it might be easier to just ship whichever CRD has the features in that our data plane supports at a given time, and having an experimental one that we're working on as the next one versus one that we all support or whatever is okay. I just wonder if we're in a different situation to the gateway folks. I honestly don't know the answer.
Yeah, I think the experimental, I don't want to call it channel, but the experimental CRD was probably meant for people to install in their kind cluster and do some raw implementations, definitely not in production. So when we do a patch release, I know we do 2 different versions, but maybe it doesn't make much sense. I don't know. And Dan, did I cut you off as you were talking about it? I just saw you go muted, but then wasn't sure. Okay, maybe he is having some network issues. Hey, Rahul, I see you joined. Yeah, Dan's definitely having networking issues. But we were just doing some follow-up discussion updates from KubeCon where we all attended, and we have 2 new NPEPs, one on dry run mode, one on service account. And we're also thinking of dropping extended fields. I think these are the major updates. I don't know, Sean, if you want to chime in and say other things. I think definitely Sean did a great job in presenting our signature policy updates. The presentation link to the schedule is in the agenda. If anybody's interested, wait for the YouTube video for sure. But he gave a shout out to Rahul's FQD and NPEP. Also gave a shout out to Hunter's great work around policy assistant. And Sean, I don't know if you want to share some of the questions you got or feedback or anything from there with folks here.
Blanking on the questions. I feel like a lot of them went to Dan, who's dropped off. I think did we mostly get questions? Just the random questions people bring when they know the SIG network call is going, and or the SIG network group is there and they want to throw questions, but I'm blanking on it. So yeah, Nadia and I split the presentation. So I did the AMP rundown. But that went smoothly, and then Nadia did the bit about policy assistant. Shame Dan's not here. He might remember what we got on the question side.
Yeah, maybe he'll rejoin, but we can wait to see. But I was in the audience and I think it looked pretty good, and people I didn't stick around for questions, unfortunately, so I wasn't sure. We also had another talk which I did for the deep dive side of ANP. Also encourage everyone to see if that made sense. But I think overall, what our community was trying to do is to just make sure that the momentum is ongoing. I know that we had a lot of interesting discussions on some of these stuff that I've listed as follow-ups. Okay, while we wait for Dan to rejoin, Sean, you have an item, Calico BANP, work in progress.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we've been working on BAMP. It didn't quite make it into our recent release. We just had to cut the cloth to get the release out, but AMP went in our recent release, and then I've been working on BAMP. So I just saw that pass the conformance tests today. So there's still some more tests that I want to write for the conversion logic and stuff, but nice to see that progressing.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that we have another BAMP implementation.
Yeah, I think Mazdak's working on plugging some of the gaps, the kind of extent, or the kind of periphery features that were sort of in flux a bit, and they didn't make it into the first release. So I think he's adding named ports. So I think named ports are in there. Does that make sense? That's what he mentioned to me anyway.
Yeah, I think named ports has not made it to core, if I remember correctly. It is still in the experimental side, so it's good to have that implemented, and then maybe we can also move that to core.
Yeah, how do folks feel about that in the other implementations? I feel like named ports might have been a bit of a misfeature in the normal network policy, but perhaps we have to follow suit to to avoid leaving people stranded. I'm not sure. But
Yeah,
from
with
Calico's point of
OVN,
view, we have an implementation, so we can map it through, and that's no problem. But yeah, sorry, didn't mean to.
oh no, no. I was just saying that like with OVN Kubernetes, one of the concerns we have is the scale impact of translating all the named ports into the container ports on the pod, especially if people have lots of pods and lots of containers, and how the ingress direction you have to query for the subject pods and the egress direction you have to query for the peer pods. So we haven't really tested named ports with scale, but I know Antrea has implemented it, OVN Kubernetes has implemented it, and now you're seeing Calico has implemented it. One of the main use cases we had named ports for was for DNS, and I know there's an issue hanging somewhere around there, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, we have an implementation for network policy, and so we can map it through to our implementation, and then we just don't worry too much about the scale impact of it. If people come back with like, I've got 1 million named ports and it's not working, we just tell them, well, maybe you shouldn't use named ports.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe we should start like a scale doc or something in our website where we start some of like just jotting down some of these concerns that we have with some of the fields. I think we had an action item for that with perf and scale the last time Bove brought this up. Maybe I should start a PR for that. But yeah, I agree with you that maybe we can wait to hear some feedback from users. And I see, Mike, you're on the call. I started a PR for gathering use cases for the whole service accounts identity discussion we had
Okay,
at
great.
KubeCon.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've linked it to the agenda.
Cool.
But for sure, and for others who don't have much of context, like I think service accounts is already supported very widely. Pretty sure Calico has it, and I think Cilium also has it. And so one of the reasons why we want to try to see if it makes sense in policy side of things is, and this was also from a discussion between both Gateway API and network policy sub projects at KubeCon, and one of the reasons why we want to see if it makes sense in our API is that the pod label selectors are mutable, so they can change over time, and throughout the life cycle, there is no guarantee of consistency ever. So eventual consistency with labels is not possible. And then some people also need to add additional webhooks and admission policies to make sure label changes are prevented, whether it's on a namespace level or a pod level. And there are these extra hooks where in case the load doesn't change dynamically over time, like label selectors are good for when things change, but if things don't really change and your pods are usually static, then you might have a use case to just have a service account, which is that every pod will have one service account for sure. And so service accounts could be another way of selecting pods. That's like the gist of the discussion, which I've tried to capture in the NPEP, but yeah, definitely review and see if it makes sense.
No, that sounds like that pretty well covers like a lot of the things that Google in particular was bringing up as concerns. I think one of the other things that we discussed was we went back and forth a bit about like whether adding service account to an existing like admin netpal or netpal itself is the right path forward, and there was a lot of concern about like interleaving like admin netpal with different levels of one service account and one IP based rules, and some projects that want identity based authorization with service account would not be interested in implementing like the IP based rules. And I think where we ended up was that a separate CRD for service account based auth is probably going to align best to like the needs of the projects that intend to implement it.
Yeah, I kind of had to run out from my talk at that point,
Okay.
so I wasn't there at the conclusion.
Oh yeah.
But is that okay? So is that what we concluded, that a new CRD might be better, and instead of putting it in the policy APIs?
Yeah, I know that like it felt less intuitive to Nadia and Dan because of like just coming from like the netpal first perspective.
Right, because I was
like,
thinking more that it would become a problem that is an implementation problem in the sense that they would have to implement the whole CRD, but that it's on the API level, it's something we shouldn't be concerned about, is what I was getting at in the first part of the meeting, but maybe I'm mistaken.
Yeah, so like because of which projects intend to implement which parts and like many want to, oh, well, not many, but like several want to only implement like the service account based authorization, it sounds like it would be a better fit to have that as a separate CRD potentially.
Okay. Rahul, you have your hand raised.
Rahul and then Sean?
Yeah, but I don't hear Rahul. I know he unmuted. Is it just me?
No, I don't hear anything either.
Let me chat and let him know that we can't hear him. Oh, he'll try to rejoin. Sean, do you want to go ahead? Wow, Rahul rejoins.
Yeah, sure. I think we have a service account selector, which the number one use case would be just to use a name label on the service accounts. We just kind of map that through to a label that gets inherited from the service account to the pod, so that you can write network policy that is based on your service account. So it's still IP based policy essentially. At the end of the day, it identifies the pods in our case. That might be a nice complement to a kind of, let's say you were doing a different CRD that's for a kind of like layer 7 and doing authentication with, you know, TLS certificates or whatever. You might still want to have a way to name the same thing that you're talking to at the network policy level as well, if you want to have your network policy block everything that's from the wrong place, but then also do the L7 policy that's actually exchanging certificates to prove who you are. It might be nice to be able to name both. I honestly don't know how much the service account selector gets used in Calico. It's kind of something that we added, and it's there, and don't often get any questions about it because it works, and it's not like it's not a crazy complicated feature. Like if you want to use it, you can use it. So yeah, I don't have a feel for its adoption level, to be honest. But I think if you were doing another type of policy that was at a different layer, you might want a way to identify the same things at your lower layer policy as well.
So the reason that we like that that is kind of what feels like a UX that would make sense if you're looking at it from an existing like NetPol implementation. What is less desirable about that is if you're doing something like layering a mesh on top of a NetPol implementation. So if you're doing Istio or Linkerd on top of something like Cilium or Calico, you don't want to, like, it would be ideal if you could switch the enforcement engine to something else that is, but using those same policies still, rather than having conflicting or different policies at that lower layer. So like from the perspective of a mesh, what is kind of the ideal case is you have IP-based rules on that lower level, and then if the bits are allowed to flow because the network has not dropped the packet based on those IP rules, then you can enforce the like identity-based authorization policy. And for Cilium service mesh, that does actually still boil down to an IP-based rule, the same as what you're talking about. So I don't think that you're we wanted to be like intentionally vague on some of the implementation details in terms of like what's required, and really just emphasize on like conformance suite of like, if this policy is defined, this is the behavior that should be expected. And I think that felt like a path forward that would work from the perspective of maintainers who are present from Cilium service mesh, Istio, and Linkerd. as well as the NetPal folks. And sorry, Nadia and Dan.
Yeah, I do want to comment back, but that was a nice summary, Mike. But I want to give a chance to Rahul, who was rejoined and has his hand raised, but I'll come back to some of the points you were talking about.
Thanks. Can
Rahul, you
guys-
want to try again?
Yeah, can you guys
I
hear
can
me?
hear you.
Okay,
Yep,
perfect.
Go for it.
Yeah, I think the question I had was around if we'd gathered use cases from people about what they want from Service Account Selector. The thing that I was thinking about, which I think Mike started to get at, is even though we all understand what Service Account Selector means in the network policy realm because we're deeply steeped in it, I can very much see the concern that someone who's not that familiar with what network policy actually is would start expecting some serious layer 7 behavior when they see service accounts. They wouldn't just expect, oh, you're selecting all the pods that use a particular Kubernetes service account. So it may, like, if we don't have a super strong use case, we might want to consider not going there just because it starts to get confusing. I realize that may not be a compelling reason, but that was just my thought.
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up. I think we had discussed this also during the meeting on, hey, does it include, when you say deny to a service account, does it include every layer of traffic, or are we going to stick with layer 3 and layer 4, which is what we've done with network policies and admin network policies, and how that would look like? And I think for sure the conclusion was, if we put it as part of the existing CRD as a peer or a subject, we are only going to do layer 3 and layer 4, because it should translate to the pod IPs on an implementation level, like most of them would. But we don't, give any guarantees on layer 7. But I think you have a great point here that it could make things confusing because people might expect it to work on some other levels. Keith, you have your hand raised.
Hey, yeah, I think that's a good discussion point. Part of so we talked about this in the Gateway API context to try to figure out, okay, where does this belong? Is it a Gateway API resource for service account? Is it network policy? And I think that we decided, especially for the mesh use case, network policy makes I think the most sense for a couple of reasons. I guess from my perspective, anything that lives within a network policy resource, whether it is an existing admin NetPol, baseline NetPol, or a new resource, needn't necessarily have any sort of impact on the implementation. If we have a service account resource, I don't know that it's necessary for us to prescribe, like for the network policy spec to prescribe where the enforcement takes place. And that can be up to the implementation.
Yep.
Like from an Istio perspective, we have a kind of a mapping with service account based on the certificate SAN. That might be how we enforce service account. Something like Cilium is going to use a Cilium identity, which is going to be an integer eBPF somehow. That's how they're going to implement service account. Like, I don't know that it's necessary for there to be a requirement as far as what layer it is implemented in for the API to exist.
I agree with all of that. I think, like, to Rahul's point, it would be helpful to at least discuss expectations around like L7 rules for things like that, of if that is expected to be part of the policy. I know Dan has had a lot of pushback in the past around like optional parts of a CRD that not all implementations are required to implement. And yeah, I think we should figure out, because I think that Cilium Service Mesh can do things with like L7 authorization policy, even though it eventually boils down to something else. It would be good to confirm details there and also see like if Calico can implement anything like that as well.
I just want to point out one thing that might be a problem going forward. Like, I understand what you're saying about it's good to leave things open to the implementations, right, on how they want to actually do these things. The problem that we need to be cognizant of is the layering problem, which I think we alluded to earlier, right? Someone might put Istio on top of any CNI. And so you need to have really, really predictable behavior so that things don't break down. So if you say service account is an L4 policy, then it's only an L4 policy, right? And everybody needs to be on the same page about what that actually means. There actually shouldn't be any ambiguity. We should be super prescriptive. Otherwise, we'll have all sorts of weird, undefined behavior.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. That was most of the conversations that we had around like why a separate CRD probably makes more sense than to insert it into something like admin netpol, because then you have two different implementations potentially needing to cooperate in a way that is unlikely to be straightforward to implement.
Yeah, Sean, I want to let you go before I chime in.
Cool.
You
So,
wanna- yeah.
Calico has an implementation of application layer policy that uses an Envoy proxy. The way that works is we interpret the Calico network policy, like our sort of superset network policy. We interpret that in two different places. We put it into the data plane, so that would be IP tables, NF tables, BPF, whatever. And then we also run an agent next to Envoy that checks the policy again. So if you have some rules in there that use application layer policy, we will in the data plane, like in the sort of kernel data plane, whichever type it is, we have to kind of allow through a superset of the traffic that could possibly be allowed to make sure we don't drop anything too early. And then in the user space code, we recheck the full policy set along with any application layer policy, so we can check HTTP parameters and we can check I'm not sure if we recheck the service account selector. I think perhaps we prototyped that at one point and didn't. I'm not sure if we actually released it. But the idea was that you could your layer 4 data plane had to kind of have a nice way to let through like the reasonable looking traffic, but then you want that extra security of verifying the certificates at layer 7 if you have the extra thing embedded. It is a little bit awkward, I must say, having the potential to interleave rules, because you could have a set of, we have ordering in policy and admin network policy and in Calico network policy. So you might have an allow rule that says allow HTTP gets, and then you have a deny all rule. But when you're implementing that in IP tables or BPF, you don't know it's a HTTP get, you just know it's on port 80, which you'd have to specify in the rule as well. So you kind of have to let through all traffic on port 80. And in some scenarios, you might have to let through loads of traffic that has no business going through in order to make sure that you don't drop anything at that level that you're not supposed to drop. So I felt like that was quite a nasty mismatch. And it might be better to have the layer 7 stuff done in a different type of policy. So that's kind of where I was coming from when I said the service account selector might be a nice thing to have in the admin network policy, because you could put the service account selector in your admin network policy, and you could put a service account selector in your theoretical layer 7 policy, and you would put the same selector, but they would mean different things. So in the admin network policy, it would mean allow through the layer 4, like, match pods that have this service account. And in the layer 7 case, it would mean check the certificate and make sure like this really is coming from that service account selector, so someone who has access to that service account's certificate. So that was kind of where I was going, that it might still be useful to have the service account selector, so you don't have to have two different ways of specifying the pods that you want to talk to.
Gotcha. I see what you're saying. I think though it sounds like your architecture is pretty similar to what Cilium is doing. And it does at the end of the day sound like the emphasis is on clean separation in terms of like, you want something at L4 plus that does not interleave into L3, L4 rules. That sounds like it would be cleaner to implement all around. Is that
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. I felt like it was quite awkward when we implemented it. I do think what we have works, but yeah, it was awkward. And as someone said earlier, that the layer 7 folks don't want to implement the entire AMP spec just to be able to pick out the one rule in the middle. But if they don't implement the whole spec, then they might have some traffic that is forwarded through because the layer 4 data plane can't tell that it shouldn't let that through because there's an interleaved rule in the middle that it doesn't know how to handle. So it's kind of, yeah, you sort of need the two to be in sync.
Yeah, I think that's the intent, is to make these decisions be able to happen separately. And the more we can do to avoid like interleaving like that, the better.
Yeah, and did I get that right? That just to write it down, I'm trying to take notes, which I'm not doing a good job of. But Rahul definitely was of the, well, I think one of the opinions you had was let's at least define the L7 versus L3 and L4 behavior, right? So I tried to write that down. What Sean, you're saying is that in Calico you do have it, but the experience has not been that good because of the whole, how do you poke a hole, let something pass, and then have an extra verifier in the L7, just not leaving a great taste. So are we all angling towards the fact that a separate CRD for L7 is where we should go with, at least so that it's well defined? But then if we are doing it in our ANP, BNP, we should stick to layer 4 and layer 3, which makes it easy. Or did I get that wrong?
That sounds good to me. But I guess we need to maybe hash out the user stories in a cap.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, before we jump into implementation. Yeah, I've tried to capture some of the user stories that came up in KubeCon, but I might have to give more concrete examples and iterate on them. So definitely feel free to review the pull request to 7.4. And then I just want to quickly jump back to Nadia's KEP or NPEP also that she has opened for the dry run mode. I think we've had quite a few discussions around this in our past meetings. And also Google had some use cases for they also wanting something like this, where you want an API field that tells you what mode your policy is in. If it's just, and I think we had a Kubernetes SIG network issue, like for network policy many eons ago, where somebody wanted to disable all of their network policies, right? Which means they don't want to delete the policies, they simply just want to disable it. And that also is trying to get folded in here. So maybe if we do have a mode or something that we can signify, whether it could be disable mode or a dry run mode or an enforce mode, like I think that's the general idea of where the NPEP is going in. She's trying to also gather use cases there. So try to take a look and leave some review comments.
Yeah.
And that's all. Yeah. Sorry. go ahead.
Yeah, if you have links to any of those old things, definitely would appreciate them in the notes.
Yeah, I'll try to see if we can put that issue for disable all policies in the notes. Yeah, we'll try to link that here. And that's all we have on the agenda. Anybody wants to bring up anything? I tried to ping Dan. I think he said his network got choppy and it booted him. So he's under reboots. Let me try to see if he's joining. Okay, I think he said that he is not able to join Zoom, so that's okay. So maybe we can end the meeting. I'll try to see if Dan can chime in on our Slack thread to share anything else you might want to share. But other than that, I think we can get our 20 minutes back if folks don't have anything else they want to bring up. Going once, twice, and so.
Just
Oh,
wanted
yeah,
to give a
Hunter.
shout out to everybody helping with policy assistant. Pretty last minute before KubeCon, so thanks everybody. And yeah, I'm happy that we got our first release. I guess the last remaining thing would be cutting the release. I know there were like some technical issues. But I guess this is more something for Dan. Do you know if Dan was still having trouble after the Go proxy suggestion? I don't know if he's still here.
He had to drop out of the call, but I think the Go proxy worked for him.
Okay, nice. Okay, yeah, I guess that's just more
Oh,
side
no, I
chat
think
kind of thing.
maybe you should start a thread with him because he's saying that he didn't do the release, but he's figured out the tags thing. So I know that the proxy stuff worked, but maybe let's catch him on the thread because he is online. It's just Zoom is kicking him out, Hunter. So
Okay, yeah, no problem. But yeah, thanks everybody.
yeah, thank you so much for all the great work on the policy assistant side. Thanks all. I will end the meeting. Have a great rest of your day. See you in 2 weeks.
Thanks. Bye.